Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Matthew. Matthew, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me on the show. My name's Matthew Boulton. I'm Director of Solar Storage and Private Wire at EDF Renewables.
Fantastic. For people who might be unaware, Matthew, can you tell us a little bit about EDF Renewables?
So we're one of the leading renewables players globally and in the UK, clearly. We have an operating portfolio of onshore and offshore wind, of solar farms and battery storage plants. We have about 1.5 gigawatts of operational assets and expect to have 10 gigawatts of operational assets by the early 2030s.
Okay, and in terms of employees and countries you cover?
So in the UK, we're about 600 people. And we're about 4,500, I think, worldwide, headquartered in Paris as part of the Électricité de France group, so sister of the EDF nuclear side as well.
Okay, fantastic. And I came across you, Matthew, as a consequence of the Superhubs Oxford project that went live last year. For people who might not have come across that, can you give us some kind of insights on how that model is helping Oxford on its journey to net zero, and how that could be replicated in other cities?
Yes, of course. So we need to explain the Oxford project is an innovation project with some government innovation sponsorship behind it, and demonstrating innovation in 3 different sectors: in the power, the electricity generation sector, in the transport sector, and in the heat sector. The innovations for our Oxford project were particularly around accessing power directly from the transmission network. So the UK, the electricity grid, a bit like the circulatory system in your body, the arteries are the transmission network, the really high voltage lines are run and operated by National Grid. And then the A roads, B roads, local roads are run by local companies. We were one of the first to realize you didn't need to be a massive power plant to plug directly into those arteries, into the transmission network. So in the power space, plugging a 50 megawatt battery into the transmission network was highly innovative. And essentially we had the battery project pay not for a single plug but for a double plug, and we plugged a cable into the second plug, which we ran around the outskirts of Oxford to their Redbridge Park and Ride, where we have Europe's most powerful charging hub. At the moment it has 22 ultra fast chargers, but it has the cable capacity going to it to have well over 100 in the future as it scales up. On the heat side, the innovation was essentially translating the logic, if you like, and the software smarts that the battery is using to trade, to sell when electricity is in short supply and charge up when there's excess. Apply that on a micro scale, residential scale, so that individual electrical heat pumps were adjusting their times of charging up and down to reduce their cost, basically.
Nice. And when you say chargers, you're obviously talking about electric vehicles. So you're charging electric vehicles. And what's the advantage of having the big 50 megawatt battery there? Why not just connect the whole thing straight to the grid?
So the vehicle charging is connected straight to the grid. In fact, the fact that the battery is there means that if the grid connection should be lost, we can switch into island mode and we can charge the vehicles from the battery. But that is only by exception and very, very rarely. Mm-hmm. Basically, the vehicles are being charged directly from the grid. It was more a question of project economics. The 50 megawatt battery is tens of millions of pounds as a total project, and it can afford to pay into 7 figures for a connection to the transmission system and access to that capacity. Once that's been paid for, it's sweating that asset, making use of that valuable capacity for a second purpose, which is why the EV charging comes off. And it's the idea that the future scalability, we only need 2 megawatts of power today, but we can have 5-10 times that in the future as demand scales, which it has to. We're still less than 2% of vehicles on the road are electric. What happens when we're fully electric? You can't have people queuing.
Yeah. And how replicable is this project?
Well, very. I mean, we've already got multiple batteries in place. So we have 4 batteries operational and 2 more in construction, 3 more in pre-construction, and all of them have been selected in locations with potential additional private wire, as we call it, demand. So that might be electric vehicles. Actually, now we're also looking at data centers. The data center market is expanding and it is capacity constrained. And again, this can be a way of opening up new, earlier access to capacity. So we're already starting to replicate it elsewhere.
Interesting. I coincidentally come from a data center background. So one of the things, I was involved in the development of a data center back in 2006, 2008 in Cork in Ireland when I lived there at the time. And one of the things we proposed for our data center, and I know it's still something that the data center I was involved in developing is still thinking of doing, is that the data center could be involved in demand side management projects and go off grid in times of high demand and sell megawatts back to the grid. Is that something that anyone else is thinking about? Have you come across that idea for data centers, or is that just complete Looney Tunes?
I've certainly come across that with refrigerated warehouses, for example, or steel factories. So I haven't, in our data center discussions, I haven't got the sense that they're that open to demand variance, because the sort of premiums for the services and the kind of revenue side is so strong. But maybe there is potential there. There's no question that demand side flexibility as a theme has to be super important. We can't, we move to renewables, you've got the intermittency challenge. Yeah. Batteries help. We can do a lot of smoothing and matching, but it's not enough. So there has to be demand side. Again, going back to the Oxford project, absolutely micro scale, of course, but that's because it was 100 or so domestic heat pumps. But if every house has got a heat pump, if every heat pump is clever enough to adjust its demand profile according to what supply there is on the grid, then that, these things can have a huge difference.
And again, something I've posited in the podcast a few times is that fridge freezers, electric immersion water heaters are batteries as well. Could they be made smarter? I
mean, they're certainly adjustable on the demand side. I don't think they're kind of batteries in as much as sort of being able to, but you're right, turning demand down is essentially the same as injecting power into the grid. So yes, demand side flexibility in the future has to extend to the Internet of Things and household appliances. Again, it feels like it's micro demand, but when you add it all together, exactly. It's a sizable chunk.
Exactly. Yeah, we're getting a bit off topic, but I just, it's the idea that your water immersion heater heats, whenever you drain it. But in fact, if it was smart, it could be listening to, and well lagged, it could be listening to the grid and then adjusting when it heats the actual water. As long as you've got hot water when you turn the tap, you don't care when it's heated. And in that sense, that's why I say that it could also, be smart.
Absolutely. And that's why this heat element to the Oxford project was so clever, really, because it also embedded the kind of property learning and understanding. So the algorithms knew, in order to take advantage of that lower price 2 hours earlier, I'm going to need to heat the house an extra 1.5 degrees because I know the rate at which heat dissipates, etc. Yeah. But it was genuinely able to shift around between times of day when the heat pump switched on to take advantage of when there was more supply.
Nice. And shifting topics, you recently received planning permission for the Longfield Solar and Battery project. What makes that project distinct, and what role will it play in the UK's renewable energy landscape?
Well, it was only the third nationally significant infrastructure project, NSIP solar project, to receive planning consent. So there's no question this this is a growing sector, but it's still one of the earliest through the doors. 400 megawatts is a significant contribution. If we think the government's target of 70 gigawatts of solar by 2035, maybe 50 gigawatts of that is expected to be ground mount as opposed to rooftop, domestic and commercial rooftop.
Right.
So it's not far off 1% of that in a single project. Mm-hmm. And it's exciting because that's nearly 100,000 homes, their annual electricity demand taken care of with a single project. So I think it raises some interesting questions. People, I think, jump too quickly to worry that we're carpeting the countryside. It doesn't. I mean, to give you a sense of scale, so for 400 megawatts of solar is essentially 400 hectares of solar panels. So kind of that would be a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer block, but we're not sticking 2 kilometer squares in the middle of the countryside. We're respecting and following the character of that landscape. We're keeping the hedgerows intact, so it will end up being across 50 different fields, and it'll look like a bit of a patchwork because we also have to pick our way round the fields, the better agricultural fields, pick out those of lower agricultural quality, for example.
Right.
But I think it is a taste of things to come.
Interesting. It's not very sunny in the UK, Matthew.
Yeah.
I say that as someone who lives in the south of Spain, so but originally come from Ireland.
I think, and that's why, frankly, the photovoltaic effect is this bit of magic. Even in UK daylight and sunlight, that single hectare is able to cover the annual demand of 250 households. I don't know what else you might plant it with, but from a sort of harvesting efficiency point of view, that seems pretty extraordinary to me. Yes, if we were in south of Spain, we might get 50 or 60% more. Mm-hmm. In the absolute, if we're high in the Atacama Desert, we might get twice as much. But it's not a factor. The fact we're in cloudy UK doesn't mean we're getting 10% of what you get there. We're still getting half, and that is still highly, highly productive. The 50 gigawatts I talked about earlier, that's 50,000 hectares. That's a lot less than 0.5% of our agricultural land across the UK.
Sure.
So it's surprisingly efficient, I think, and a relatively small overall amount of land space we're talking about.
And there is such a thing as agrivoltaics as well. I'm not sure if you've looked into that, but just because you have solar panels on a field doesn't mean that they can't be farmed as well, either with the solar panels on stilts with crops under them, or with sheep or cattle grazing under them. I mean, they can be complementary.
Well, certainly grazing or sheep, I think, rather than cattle are a bit heavy and clumsy, I think. But sheep grazing is already very common on solar farms across the UK, and kind of you get natural grass cutting taken care of. Actually growing things under or in between the panels is being looked at, and as EDF we have some interesting pilot projects already in France, and so it's certainly on our radar. At the moment, the economics don't quite stack up, and in fact, with new sort of panel types, tend to be packing the panels a bit more densely in those areas. But equally, it's good to recognize that the land itself that is under those panels is actually naturally enhanced because it is left fallow. There's very little disturbance by piling in the posts for solar panels.
Sure. And
any project has to demonstrate biodiversity net gain. So it's also what we do in the space that we're not putting under solar panels. We've also just gone into phase 2 consultation on a big Lincolnshire project under the same NSIP scheme. And it's less than half the total available area that we're proposing to actually put under solar panels, and significant portion of the rest will be subject to kind of enhancement replanting and additional planting strategies,
Nice.
and obviously some of it left for existing agriculture. So yeah, different ways of approaching it.
And what size is the Lincolnshire one?
So it is bigger. Obviously it will depend how this phase of consultation goes. It's an 800 megawatt connection as opposed to the Longfield, the 400. Well, we have a 500 megawatt connection at Longfield, 400 megawatts of solar. So it'll be sort of up to 800 in Lincolnshire.
And batteries in both of them?
Yes, and batteries in both. I mean, clearly batteries take only a tiny proportion of the land. So if we were to have a 500 megawatt battery, that would be, 10 or 15 hectares. So relatively small. But I think we have to see renewables and battery storage as going hand in hand, right? Whatever progress we make on demand side flexibility, we need some additional supply side flexibility as well. You can't control when the sun shines, when the wind blows, and batteries can help move that around to the between times of day at least.
Okay. And I mean, when I'm looking at projects in the likes of Australia, sometimes they'll have 2-hour batteries, sometimes a 4-hour battery. So a 4-hour battery for a 400 megawatt site would be a 1.6 gigawatt battery. But it sounds like if you're talking 500, you're talking about a 1-hour battery kind of thing.
Sorry, so I was just talking about the power rating, so the megawatts rather than the megawatt hours.
Okay.
At the moment, we're assuming a 2-hour battery. I mean, the expectation is over time that will inch up 3 hours, maybe 4 hours. But the timescales for these projects, we're assuming it would be 2-hour batteries.
And it all depends on the economics as well, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think in some of the particularly US projects as well, for example, where the batteries are often wrapped together with the solar under a kind of scheme from the utility company itself, and that will be 4 or 6 hour batteries very specifically to move the solar around. In our projects, the solar is operating, the battery is operating. The battery is there directly connected to the grid, providing services to the grid. It's not purely providing a route for the solar we're generating on site. It's sharing that grid connection and providing complementary services.
Okay, sure. What about with these NSIP projects, public concerns from like visual impact and food security? How are you addressing those? And you talked about the consultation project that's going on, or process that's going on at the moment for the Lincolnshire one. How's all that working out?
Yeah, so for these big projects, we tend to do 2 phases of consultation. So by law, you're required to do the second phase that we've just announced for Lincolnshire. We did a previous kind of preliminary phase back in the summer, particularly targeted at those residents most closest to it. So yes, I think, visual impact is clearly a concern and fully understand that. I mean, again, I think people sometimes overestimate or misunderstand that the kind of the kit that's actually involved and the impact it has. If you're on pretty flat land, which we tend to be because that makes it easier to build, very little of a solar farm extends above 3 meters high. Yeah. And if you've got pretty decent hedgerows and stuff and it's flat land, you often don't even know it's there. And an important part of the site development is to understand those screening possibilities and which, let's say, within the overall parcel, which bits lend themselves to easier screening. There's already more screening, and then how you enhance that. I think food security comes up a lot, and it slightly surprises me. I think, again, I talked earlier about the scale of what solar would mean. So I think people may overestimate, how much of this stuff we're actually talking about, and say it's less than 0.5% of agricultural land. I think as well it makes sense to try and link in people's mind food security to decarbonisation. If we don't find ways to stop burning fossil fuels globally, we're going to have much bigger impacts on our food yields. That's for sure. People worry about noise, but again, those concerns tend to dissipate once they find out more. I mean, solar farms, they are very, very quiet. It's the beauty of the things that there's no real moving parts. The batteries, slightly more hum, if you like, but again, they're smaller spaces, and we tend to be able to kind of make sure those are more secluded. People, when you're taking up that much space, the chances are you're impacting footpaths, for example. So we won't shut paths off, but your dog walk's not quite the same if you're walking through a kind of channel and you've got solar panels either side. But we tend, part of what we do in the kind of remaining land areas, to try and open up new sort of permissive paths, landowner volunteered paths, to provide some alternative routes, if you like. And then I guess construction disruption. Again, we try and choose sites with decent access and make sure the construction compounds are reasonably close to mainish roads. So, yeah, those are the main ones that come up.
Yeah. Personally, if I was walking my dog, I'd love to be able to go through a field of solar panels, but that's just me.
I think that's part of our challenge, right? Is to get people to embrace the positive side behind this. And as I say, it's a slightly magical effect. The idea you can put lay sheets of glass out quietly in the countryside, and they can produce that much energy. Is extraordinary for me. There aren't many ways you can take care of 250 households, many dimensions in a single hectare. It's very productive.
Yeah. And as you say, if the ground under it is being left fallow and you're increasing biodiversity in the area as well, that's got to be a huge positive for the neighbours around it, rather than, if it was a coal-fired power plant, for example, or an oil refinery, or some other horrible fossil fuel project.
Absolutely. I mean, now by law, any such project has to demonstrate a 10% biodiversity net gain, but we'd certainly look to clear that comfortably. A Longfield project is well over 50% biodiversity net gain. I think the other angle is also, there is scope and there should be some community benefit. You are impacting their environment to a degree. And so on our Lincolnshire project, we're committing to a £400 per megawatt per year contribution to a community fund that the community would then decide how best to deploy. Nice. Obviously, we hope it's in green-related areas. We particularly hope it might be in kind of skills and training areas, because the green revolution we know we haven't got the existing electrical and construction skills, so we need to build those. So there should be some great opportunities for local youngsters thinking about careers to join, and we're hoping, if it were an 800 megawatt project, that'd be £320,000 a year into such a fund. Yeah. You can do some quite interesting stuff with that at a local level.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Obviously, batteries aren't the only grid storage solution. We've talked a little bit about demand side management. Is that being rolled out as well with the solar, or is that just with the super hubs, or are there other demand side management things you're looking at?
So the heat angle was quite specific to the Oxford project, in as much it was more trying to leverage the logic behind the trading batteries into that space. You clearly, for domestic heat purposes, you don't need the kind of electrical connections we're dealing with for these big projects, but we're definitely hoping to extend some demand side activity to these projects, whether that be data centers, whether that be EV charging stations, because again, how great if that electricity that's being generated in the field is being consumed immediately next door by that data center or by that EV charging station. So we definitely want these to evolve into hubs with a demand dimension as well.
Okay, interesting. I had a woman on the podcast a few weeks back called Sabine Erlinghagen, CEO of Siemens Smart Grid Infrastructure. And one of the points that she brought up at the time was how the grid is actually at the moment kind of a bottleneck for the rollout of a lot of these renewable energy projects, and how Siemens are helping companies get more from their grids, increase their capacity without having to increase the infrastructure. But the point I'm getting to is that's all well and good, but I'm sure over time, I'm hoping over time that will improve. What happens though when you've got 50 to 70 gigawatts of solar and it's a sunny day and demand is low? What happens to the grid in that kind of scenario when there's far too much energy being produced?
Two interesting, quite different challenges there. So taking the second one first, I mean, at the moment we have a grid that averages 30, 35, 40 gigawatts. So 70 gigawatts of solar won't often be producing at max output, but there will be, bright summer days. But by the time that's happening, we're also expecting our total demand to have increased significantly. Yes, that by the time we electrify transport, by the time we electrify heat, let's see what role green hydrogen has to play and how much electricity that needs to generate. We're going to be talking at least double, maybe triple current levels. So it's a bigger baseline you're hitting. But I think a lot of it is going to come down to some of those demand side signals. I think there's an interesting angle in there as well, whether already companies, some of the big companies have been quite progressive in committing to zero carbon consumption. But the way that's managed at the moment is essentially on a kind of annual reconciliation basis. You see how many megawatt hours you've consumed across your operations, and then you make sure you've purchased a corresponding number of clean megawatt hour certificates from solar farms or wind farms. And if the numbers match up for the year, you can just declare yourself clean. But I think increasingly down the road, we're going to be needing people to hold themselves to a slightly more sophisticated measure where certificates are being matched on an hourly basis, so that you're actually, as you're consuming, where it's coming from, and you've paid for the privilege of having that green. So I that's what I'd say on the kind of the demand side and how to make use of the 70 gigawatts of solar. But going back to your comments on Sabina from Siemens and the grid concerns, absolutely, and to a degree that sort of was the starting point again for that Oxford project. We have a grid which was world leading in the 1950s, but it was designed for a very different world where 1.5 kilowatts was enough for every house.
Right.
So, massive investment is going to be needed. There was a very interesting and good, I thought, Windsor report came out recently challenging National Grid, but government and Ofgem really to take a more strategic view of how to invest in grid. It's all quite piecemeal at the moment. But in the meantime, we need to sweat the grid that we have as cleverly as we can, and that's exactly what we're trying to do with these energy hubs.
Cool. And looking to the future, Matthew, what are some of the innovative approaches EDF Renewables is exploring in upcoming projects to further advance the UK's low-carbon electricity network?
I look after the solar and storage and private wire space. So I think we would say we are leading in the innovation in that space. And now the challenge is to kind of accelerate the replication. I think, yes, we're very interested as well in how to solve some of the longer duration challenges. The lithium batteries we use at the moment are suitable for time of day shifting, but they're not going to provide days worth of storage. So that is a dimension we are very much exploring and wanting to find solutions for. We're interested in hydrogen. We've just got our first hydrogen project getting underway. So I think those are the areas in kind of new tech where we're looking. But I think a lot of it also we think is on the kind of business model side and the kind of energy hub, how you can integrate different aspects of supply and demand to use things more efficiently and more cleverly.
Okay, cool. And of course, smarter energy isn't just about technology. Can you talk a little bit about potential economic and social impacts like job creation, cost savings, and things like that are associated with renewable energy projects?
Yes, so I think from a cost-saving point of view, clearly the context of the last couple of years have shown how disruptable the kind of fossil fuel markets are, if you like. Once you have a renewables-based grid, you simply don't have the same volatility on the supply side, and the costs are already very competitive, right? The costs of new build onshore wind or solar per megawatt hour are certainly lower than the costs of new build CCGT, or you'd go down that road. On the job creation front, I think there's a fascinating challenge, and I tried to touch on earlier, I think with some of these big projects we've got and where we have community funds we're looking to deploy, we really need to be maximizing the opportunity for skills building. The amount of grid investment required, as well as the amount of renewable assets that are going to be built. So the amount of skilled electricians we're going to need is way higher than we've got at the moment. We're not even close to being on trajectory for that. So and that's above my pay grade. That's a kind of national strategic challenge we have to address. But it's not just electricians, right? I mean, these are construction projects. There's a whole supply chain of construction-related jobs we should be looking to build. Historically, in the solar sector, we tended to sort of import that expertise from the continent because they had already done lots of this stuff. Clearly, it's a bit more difficult to do that now, just post-Brexit and visa-wise. And why would we? Why wouldn't we be looking to build those internal supply chains and competences, given how much stuff we're going to be building on our shores?
Nice. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Matthew. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I know you told me you were going to ask me that, and I've forgotten that was coming, so let me just have maybe not a question, but if you just sort of let me share one parting reflection. I think just going back to these big solar projects, I just like people to allow themselves to maybe get a little bit excited that we're able to do this at the scale and speed, because the clock is ticking. Net zero is not a 2050 deadline. It's a carbon budget, and every year that we don't make enough progress actually brings that deadline forward. So I think these big projects, whilst they may look a bit scary from the outside, really should be welcomed as significant steps on that road to net zero.
Great. Super. Fantastic. Matthew, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
So please go just look up EDF Renewables online, or if it was the Oxford stuff that piqued your interest, look up Energy Superhub Oxford, or if it was the solar projects, then look up Springwell Solar Farm or Longfield Solar Farm on the web.
Super. Great. Fascinating. Matthew, that's been really interesting. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.